My golden child sister was always favored, but I finally got my revenge. I spent my entire life being discriminated against because of my golden child sister, whom my parents always favored. No matter what she did, they believed her over me, punishing me while letting her off easy, even when I had undeniable proof. The ultimate betrayal came on my wedding day when she tried to steal the spotlight by walking down the aisle in a bridal gown. But that was the day I finally got my sweet revenge and exposed the truth once and for all. My parents showed a clear favoritism toward my sister, and it wasn't subtle either. If my sister ever accused me of something, I was immediately punished without question. If I pointed fingers at her, my accusations were dismissed, even when there was undeniable proof. On the rare occasion that she did receive any punishment, it was always much lighter than what I would have gotten, and somehow they'd still find a way to reprimand me too. Birthdays, her cake of choice, mine, always a flavor she liked. When I complained, my parents would act surprised, feigning ignorance about my preferences. Outings and trips that were meant to celebrate me would always revolve around what she wanted. It was like my existence was constantly overshadowed by her whims. As we grew older, my sister only became more spoiled and resentful. Though at first she mostly ignored me, things took a sharp turn during our teenage years. I'm not sure if it was because she lost her friends or because they abandoned her due to her toxic personality, but at some point, she found herself completely friendless. We attended the same school, so I noticed a shift. She went from being surrounded by people to wandering the halls alone. And that's when the real nightmare began. Suddenly, I wasn't just an occasional target for her frustrations. I became her sworn enemy. She accused me of everything under the sun, and my parents, of course, believed her every word. She even targeted my friends, resulting in my parents forbidding me from hanging out with them. The reasons varied from "your sister says they're bad influences" to "why can't you be more like her and enjoy spending time with family?" The only thing that kept me from complete isolation was my extended family. Thankfully, most of our relatives lived in the same town, and I got along well with my cousins. At one family gathering, when they invited me out to do something, I had to sadly decline, explaining that I wasn't allowed to have friends because my sister didn't have any. Word got back to the adults, and my parents were absolutely ripped apart by them. Of course, I was punished for lying, but the scolding must have hit a nerve because they gave me a bit more freedom afterward. As for my sister, she was so humiliated by the fact that extended family knew about her lack of friends that she demanded to change schools, and my parents quickly obliged despite the higher cost. She did manage to make new friends at her new school, but things between us never returned to the previous dynamic. She had tasted the power of making my life miserable and wasn't about to let it go. The years that followed were no better. Her friends came over and bullied me under the guise of light teasing, as my parents put it. I never invited my own friends over because my parents were terrible hosts, and my sister had a habit of accusing them of stealing things, which my parents, of course, believed. My only solace during this time was my close relationship with my cousins, as my parents wouldn't dare pull this nonsense with family. Then came the boyfriend saga. I didn't want to bring him home, but my parents insisted. As soon as we were separated, he came to find me, telling me that my sister had been flirting with him, by which she meant she had paraded around in skimpy clothing, batted her eyelashes in the most obnoxious way, and tried to convince him that I was terrible while she was oh so amazing. He was creeped out and immediately came to tell me. Naturally, my sister had a different version of events, claiming that he had tried to flirt with her, but that she had nobly turned him down out of respect for me. Guess who my parents believed? I should mention here that my sister and I are very different in terms of appearance. While I've always been on the slimmer side, thanks to being denied treats as punishment, my parents and my sister have always struggled with their weight. Now, I'm not saying looks are everything, but my sister had a terrible personality on top of it all, and her attempts at flirting were awkward at best. My teenage self knew, without a doubt, that my boyfriend wasn't interested in her. Still, my parents forbade me from seeing him. We tried to keep the relationship going in secret, but it didn't last. The same thing happened with my next boyfriend. My sister tried flirting with him. He rejected her, and she accused him of making advances. Once again, my parents believed her, claiming I was incapable of choosing decent people to date. It became a running theme, and I eventually gave up on relationships altogether, earning myself a bad reputation at school because I would make out with boys but refuse to date anyone seriously. Time went by, and the favoritism continued. My sister had more spending money, looser curfews, and more freedom in general. When I pointed out the unfairness, my parents would claim it was because she was older. But when I reached the same age, the rules didn't change for me. They'd simply deny ever saying that or find another excuse for why I couldn't be trusted. Fast forward to my sister's high school graduation. She got into a college, though not a prestigious one, and certainly didn't have any scholarships. Despite her mediocre grades, my parents made a huge deal out of it and promised to pay for everything. I was just relieved she'd be away at college, even if it didn't make much of a difference when she visited home every other weekend, still finding ways to torment me. When it came time for my graduation, my mother pulled me aside for a chat. She informed me that since they were paying for my sister's education, they couldn't afford to pay for mine. Instead, it would be better if I started working right after graduation and waited until my sister finished college to see if they could afford to help me then. Also, if I stayed at home, I'd be expected to contribute to the bills and pay rent. I knew this was coming. I had never once expected my parents to support my education. In fact, I had been preparing for this scenario for years. While my social life was restricted, I had spent all my time studying. I saw education as my only ticket to freedom, and so I worked tirelessly to earn a scholarship. Not to an Ivy League school, but a decent one with a full scholarship to boot. I announced the scholarship on social media at the same time I told my parents, thanking them for their support publicly, so they couldn't easily backtrack. They initially seemed proud, but my sister quickly soured their attitude. They even tried to convince me not to go, citing my sister's struggles in college as evidence that I would fare worse. Naturally, I stuck to my plan, and they couldn't do anything to stop me. College was my saving grace. I thrived away from them, and while I maintained contact, I visited less and less. During this time, I avoided introducing any significant others to my family, knowing full well what would happen. At this point, my sister dropped out of college, moved back home, and landed a job at the same company as my mother, thanks to my mom pulling strings, of course. She paid no bills, no rent, and was still coddled by my parents. Meanwhile, I had carved out a life of my own. And then I met my now husband. He's the complete opposite of me, quick-witted, assertive, and not afraid to call out bad behavior. While I tend to freeze up in situations, he's always ready with a sharp retort. We balance each other out, and he loves resolving drama, much to my relief. When we began discussing marriage, we decided to keep the ceremony low-key, preferring to spend our money on a dream honeymoon to Europe. Since my family was mostly concentrated in my hometown, we planned to hold the wedding there, making it easier to manage logistics. We sent out engagement announcements and saved the dates, fully expecting some pushback from my family. Naturally, my parents insisted on meeting my fiancé. I was hesitant, but my husband was all for it, even buying a hidden recorder to capture any nonsense that might go down. He was excited about the prospect of rejecting my sister's inevitable advances and exposing her to the family. However, when he returned from the meeting, he was positively gleeful. "Babe, you won't believe what they wanted," he exclaimed. I found myself perplexed, craving to hear the recording, but he, astutely, advised me to listen to him first, lest I misconstrue his intentions. So off he went, and instead of any anticipated playful banter, my parents, alongside my sister, corralled him into a conversation. After a few grumbles expressing their dissatisfaction with him and questioning my judgment, they made an outlandish proposition. They were willing to finance our wedding, but with a glaring caveat. My sister would walk down the aisle before me, adorned in a bridal gown herself. Their justification? It wasn't right for a younger sibling to wed first, so they decreed that my sister should at least experience this ceremony at my venue in full bridal regalia, complete with photographs and her own cake. Now my husband, vengeful husband, to be precise, takes over. Hey, vengeful spouse here. There's no wrath quite like that of a lurker on revenge, instant karma, or nuclear revenge, especially when their beloved has been slighted. As quick-witted as my wife, she's my wife now, T.E., portrays me to be, my brain short-circuited when they pitched this outrageous idea like it was some kind of grand gift. Even the people of Troy would have gladly let in that wooden horse again over such nonsense. However, once my mind rebooted, a sinister little voice whispered to string them along. So I told them I'd think about it, see how my fiancé, now wife, would react, and I bolted before I gave away any hints of my plans. Back to me, the wife. My husband recounted how my parents wanted my wedding to center around my sister, all with a mischievous grin. And of course, he had the recording to corroborate it. I was floored. The distance from them had softened the harshness of their treatment towards me, and I was in disbelief that they'd stooped so low. Yet, Thanks to my husband's unwavering focus on revenge, I was able to avoid spiraling into a darker place. Together, we reveled in brainstorming the most outlandish methods of retaliation, from the absurd to the plausible. We eventually looped in his more rational brother when we settled on a plan. It involved giving two different venue addresses, misleading them entirely. However, his brother, while chastising us, acknowledged our determination for payback, but also pointed out the difficulty in executing such a ruse without getting sued. So we dialed back our ambitions to something more feasible, pretending to go along with their plan but hiring security to ensure my sister was barred from entry. But of course, we couldn't leave it there. That wouldn't be satisfying enough for true revenge. The rest, mostly masterminded by my husband, was a joint effort that we meticulously discussed beforehand. He returned to my parents, claiming I wasn't on board with the plan, but also that he didn't want to see our family fracture over it. He suggested I'd be less likely to make a scene if surprised, as I generally dislike confrontation. However, marriage is a monumental occasion, and who knows how I'd react. His proposed compromise was that they help fund aspects of the wedding. In doing so, I feel indebted to them, less inclined to make a fuss during the ceremony. He said my parents were taken aback. While my grown sister gleefully pranced like a child, they accepted the plan without hesitation. My husband also cleverly introduced a backstory. I had poor judgment in past relationships, making me paranoid and controlling, constantly checking his phone to ensure fidelity. Hence, it was crucial that none of this plan be committed to writing. Every discussion about my sister's bridal debut would happen in person, face to face. Thus began months of subterfuge. While my parents and sister thought they were outwitting me, my husband and I were squeezing every advantage from them. They wanted to have a say in everything. My husband managed to convince them to relinquish control over things important to me, like the music and color scheme, but let them have free rein over elements we couldn't care less about. This made them feel in control. For example, we'd go to check menu options and choose the cheapest. Then my husband would secretly bring my sister along, letting her lament how she wished for something grander, leading my parents to insist on paying for the more luxurious options. This pattern repeated for the photographer, the flowers, everything. My sister, with my husband's help, managed to drive them to spend far more than we ever would have. My parents, thinking they were indulging her, were actually being manipulated into bankrolling our dream wedding. The wedding dress, however, presented a hiccup. My parents pushed for an unflattering gown for me, and though we intended to accept and just not wear it, my mom sent a message confirming my agreement, leaving us with a digital trail. I had to refuse outright in writing. My husband then negotiated, pretending to agree with my sister's suggestion to sabotage my actual dress. Of course, we had no intention of letting that happen. Throughout all of this, they maintained minimal text communication, fearing my neurotic tendencies, which my husband played up brilliantly. Whenever my sister messaged him, I would reply instead, further cementing the narrative that I was possessive and controlling. Yes, my sister did try to flirt with him. He played the part of a conflicted man perfectly, walking the tightrope of maintaining their trust while never betraying mine. He even shared false confidences with them, reinforcing their belief that he was on their side. But of course, they never knew about the security we hired. It's almost amusing in a twisted way. My husband and I, who had once seriously entertained the notion of a modest courthouse wedding, opting to redirect funds toward an unforgettable honeymoon, ended up orchestrating this grandiose, lavish wedding, barely shelling out a dime ourselves. We affectionately referred to it as compensation for emotional distress, courtesy of my parents, haha. I believe my husband, he's just confirmed my suspicions, by the way, lol, took far more pleasure in the art of deception than in the actual wedding planning process. I mean, I never imagined I'd see a man so genuinely delighted at the prospect of burning through an entire Saturday on a monotonous road trip just to discuss wedding minutiae with his in-laws, yet somehow here we are. Then came the day of reckoning. The master plan concocted by my parents, sister, and husband was cunning in its simplicity. Once everyone was seated, my sister would make her entrance at precisely the same moment a bride traditionally does, fashionably late. The goal? To slip her in unnoticed while ensuring I wouldn't catch a glimpse and halt their shenanigans. By the time I caught wind of the situation, the damage would have already been done. As for the dress debacle, we had saved some leftover fabric from my gown alterations. My husband, ever the actor, brought this fabric to my parents' house, where my sister still resides, by the way, presenting it as evidence that the dress had been destroyed. He claimed he had to rush back to me to quell my rage, and that he'd see them at the wedding once the storm had calmed. We ensured the real security detail remained under wraps at first. As the guests and my parents arrived, all they could spot was a woman checking off names from a list. It wasn't until my parents had settled into their seats that we revealed our true security force, a man with the unmistakable aura of a bodyguard. His one job, to prevent my sister from entering the venue, and we promised him a generous tip if he kept our little arrangement a secret. The moment finally arrived. My parents received a text saying my sister was less than 5 minutes away. At this point, my father rallied the troops, signaling that it was time to kick things off. My bridesmaids, having been instructed to follow his lead, did so without hesitation. My father took his position at the entrance, seemingly awaiting my grand entrance. Meanwhile, one of my friends who wasn't part of the wedding party sent me a discreet text to prepare. The logic behind this? If my husband or bridesmaids had whipped out their phones, it might have raised suspicion. This friend, ever the drama enthusiast and a close ally of my husband, was more than willing to participate in our charade. As my father stood at the ready, the bridal march began. The door swung open, and there I was. My father looked utterly stunned, his eyes darting behind me, desperately searching for my sister. But from his vantage point, the venue entrance was completely obscured. His phone rang, and I caught a glimpse of the caller ID. It was her. Without a word, he mumbled something unintelligible and bolted, leaving me standing there, utterly bewildered. Gasps echoed through the room as confusion spread like wildfire. My in-the-know friend dramatically asked, "What just happened?" Feigning tears, I responded with, "He told me I wasn't supposed to be here." That wasn't what he had said, but my husband and I had agreed that if my father dared abandon me, I'd twist the narrative to make him appear as monstrous as possible. As for the tears, while I'd love to claim it was just my Oscar-worthy acting, a part of me genuinely couldn't believe he'd go so far as to leave me stranded. Deep down, I had held out hope that the entire scheme was some elaborate joke. I was genuinely hurt, and holding back tears wasn't easy. My friend, ever the dramatic, cried out, "What did he mean by that?" ensuring that everyone within earshot heard her. Then she loudly declared, "I'm going to find out," before storming off to stir chaos with the security guard and prevent my father from returning. At some point, my mother also slipped away. At this moment, my husband's father, who had been forewarned, rushed over to escort me down the aisle. His sudden dash brought a much-needed smile to my face. I made my way toward my soon-to-be husband, surrounded by hushed whispers and curious glances. As soon as I reached him, everything felt right again. He lightened the mood, joking that my tearful performance deserved an award, and assured me with a mischievous grin that he'd give my parents hell for what they had done, lol. Later, I pieced together the full story from various sources: friends, family, the security guard, and of course, my husband. Apparently, my sister did indeed show up in a wedding dress. Security, as instructed, denied her entry, claiming there was already a bride at the venue. My father tried to intimidate the guard, threatening to call the police, but the guard, being on our payroll, wasn't fazed. He simply offered to involve law enforcement if necessary. Realizing the futility of the situation, my father changed tactics and demanded my sister be let in. At this point, my dramatic friend arrived on the scene, hurling insults and accusations, stalling for as much time as possible. Eventually, my mother joined the chaos along with a few other guests. The entire plan had unraveled. All my parents could do now was damage control as word spread like wildfire. They tried to shift the blame onto my husband, claiming he had been in on the scheme. But when my husband was summoned to the scene, he played his part flawlessly: confusion, denial, and indignation. Gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss, as he would later say with a smirk. When they pressed him for proof, he demanded receipts, knowing full well they had none. Every text exchange they could produce was about mundane wedding arrangements, not their ludicrous plot. My sister, in true melodramatic fashion, collapsed to the floor, kicking and screaming like a child. My father looked as though he might physically assault my husband, but others intervened, holding him back. My parents insisted that my husband had orchestrated the plan and that they had simply followed his lead. But with no evidence to back up their claims, they were left floundering. My husband masterfully turned the tables, chastising them for their outrageous behavior and reiterating that he would never agree to something so absurd. He then calmly returned to the wedding, leaving them to deal with the fallout. Some guests had captured portions of the spectacle on their phones, and later, watching my parents and sister face public humiliation was nothing short of cathartic. After years of being accused of wrongdoing and never believed, seeing them receive their comeuppance was one of the sweetest wedding gifts I could have imagined. My mother was in tears, my father alternated between shades of purple and pale white, and my sister remained on the floor wailing. They continued to insist that my husband had been complicit in their plan, but no one believed them. Eventually, they were asked to leave and had no choice but to do so. My father had to physically drag my sister off the ground. That evening, no one said a word to me about the incident. I suspect they were trying to shield me from the drama. Perhaps it was because I was the bride, but it felt as though everyone was making an extra effort to be kind and enthusiastic throughout the celebration. My husband cheekily remarked that the expensive food and drinks likely played a part in keeping everyone in good spirits. Lol. We had an incredible time. My husband only maintained his fox-angry facade for a short while before his natural smile broke through. Afterward, we retreated to our hotel to rest before heading off on our honeymoon. Side note, my parents had offered to pay for our plane tickets, but we declined, fearing they might try to cancel them or pull another stunt. Since the wedding, my parents and sister have repeatedly tried to contact me. Following my husband's advice, I've ignored their calls to maintain a paper trail. This turned out to be a smart move, as my sister eventually sent me an unhinged message. I won't repeat the nonsense she spewed, but suffice it to say, she blamed me for her humiliation, called my husband a two-faced snake who had deceived them for months. My husband, ever the joker, wants to frame that quote and hang it on our wall, lol, and even suggested that my husband was cheating on me, with her no less. My husband, ever the strategist, took my phone, captured screenshots of the call logs, my sister's messages, and even texts from my parents demanding that I pick up the phone. He then sent all of this to our family group chat, along with screenshots of messages they had sent him, where they called him names and hurled threats. He concluded with a statement to the effect of, "If I see any of you again, I'll call the cops." I feel oddly liberated after sending that message. Yesterday, I received another text from my sister, demanding that I apologize to her for ruining her wedding. It took everything in me not to respond.